The Williams team have barely been out of the headlines this season. There have been crashes, disqualifications, car upgrades, driver upgrades, and a rare double points finish in Azerbaijan. This week, we ask how these former champions turned backmarkers have managed to turn things around. It's something of a question, isn't it? Are we being a bit premature? Have Williams really turned things around? Yeah, that double points finish in Baku. Was it a little bit lucky? After all, there was a Ferrari versus Red Bull crash in the closing laps of the race that elevated both Williams drivers further up the finishing order. And Colapinto is definitely something of a revelation, not just for the Williams team, but everybody in the paddock. The Argentine driver is clearly pushing Alex Albon harder than he ever has been pushed before, at least since he left Red Bull. But let's stop talking about the drivers and let's dig into the really interesting stuff. That's the car. And has the car actually got better? Well, Williams introduced a really big upgrade package in Zandvoort, but that weekend was a bit of a write-off for the team. Not least because one of the drivers wrote off one of the cars, and the other car had a flaw on it which proved to be illegal. Williams had a little bit of a measuring issue in the pits that didn't quite match up to the FIA's measurement system, so you couldn't really balance things out, and you couldn't really say whether that package really worked at Zandvoort. The weather was a factor there as well. Moving on to Monza, well, Williams were quick in Monza. What a shock. They've been there every single year because it's a low drag, low downforce car. It works quite well at top speeds. That's what we sort of expect to see from Williams whenever you go to a fast circuit. But what really got me interested in the Williams performance and the upgrades is this data from Azerbaijan. This is from free practice 3 because the fastest laps from qualifying for both Colapinto and Alex Albon were so rudely interrupted by the Williams team forgetting to remove one of those cooling blowers from the top of Albon's car, and it sort of ruined the laps for not just Albon and Colapinto, but also a few other drivers in the field. So we never really got to see the maximum performance from the Williams in qualifying, but we did see what the best they could do in Q3 was in qualifying simulation runs. And this is unusual because we're comparing Alex Albon to Sergio Perez's Red Bull. Yes, it's not the quickest of the two Red Bulls, but Perez around Azerbaijan is a pretty good levelling board. You can compare quite a lot of drivers and quite a lot of things to him, but you can also compare the car performance. And this data, for those who watch F1TV live, you've probably seen this already, but I thought we'd go a little bit deeper into it. Now you can see that Albon is about 0.2 of a second slower than the Red Bull, which isn't very much around such a long circuit. And you can see full throttle time is significantly down, 57% full throttle around the lap compared to Perez's 61%. That's sort of what you expect. And actually, if you look at the data, Albon is behind Perez. Car performance is lower on the Williams, but not everywhere. Have a look at some of the data here. There are some points that you don't sort of expect to see. At the end of the straights, you can see that the Williams is actually topping out before the Red Bull. The Red Bull has a higher top speed, and that flattening off of those acceleration curves, that's the speed curve you can see I'm highlighting here. That flattening off is what you call clipping. The Mercedes power unit is running out of electrical energy and it's just stopping accelerating. So it's sort of going into harvest mode or just doesn't accelerate as much. The Honda powered Red Bull just keeps accelerating down to the end of the straight. Sure, fair enough, the Red Bull's got higher top speed. Not a normal thing you'd expect to see from Red Bull, normally low on the top speed, compared to Williams, normally high on the top speed, but it doesn't really matter. It's not the big difference. Actually, when you start looking at where around the lap the Williams is quicker than the Red Bull, have a look from turn 16 all the way down to turn 1, the big long straight. What a surprise, Williams is quicker than Red Bull. Wait a minute, didn't I just say the Red Bull was quicker at top speed? Yes, I did, but top speed isn't everything. It's how that speed is made. If you have a look here at the end of the lap, you can see that the Red Bull, yeah, sure, it's slightly quicker, better traction out of that final corner. But look, the Williams is that white line for Williams, Alex Albon, is starting to emerge from behind the blue line for Sergio Perez. The Williams is getting up to its maximum speed quicker than the Red Bull, suggesting a little bit less drag, not a surprise. And in fact, all the way along that very long straight at Baku, the Williams is quicker. And the only time Perez starts to overhaul the Williams and build up to that high top speed is when the Red Bull opens its DRS, and you can see the crossover there very, very clearly. And that's actually a really important factor because the Williams is beginning to make time in ways we don't expect. It isn't the streamliner it used to be. That's a deliberate move from the team, I think. But look here, from turns 3 through to turns 12, the twisty bit, the Williams is quicker than the Red Bull. And that is something that's completely new for the Williams team. So this big upgrade package they introduced in Zandvoort seems to be working. But exactly what is so good about it? Well, Lawrence Barretto put that question exactly to Pat Fry in the pit lane earlier today.
We obviously had a hard winter and we've had a lot of crashes. So in reality, we spent a lot of time making bits that we didn't really need to make. So all these things, once you're on the back foot a little bit, it does take a while. Certainly the upgrade for Zandvoort is working. It seems to work well at all the tracks we've taken it to so far. So that's a good thing. At least we got the correlation and stuff like that working. We just need to see what this is like, really.
It truly has been a hard winter for the Williams team. Pat Fry's absolutely right. But also a hard spring and quite a hard summer because of the hard hits that the Williams drivers have inflicted on the car. Yes, the team struggled to get their cars ready for the start of the season, and they struggled to make the weight limit as well, something that didn't get solved till later in the year, but also smashing cars to pieces like this. Alex Albon in Melbourne, that's taking out from the cost cap. All of the money that has to be spent and all the effort has to be spent on rebuilding the car is time that's taken away from the car's development and introducing new parts. That's something that's held back Williams quite a lot. The other problems Williams have faced is the car was a bit of a pig to drive at times. Look here, Albon in the S's at Suzuka. Look how much the Anglo Thai driver is fighting that car. It looks awful to drive all the way through this very tricky section of the Japanese track. That's something the team need to get on top of. But actually, some of these upgrades have actually been designed to address exactly that. Have a listen to what Pat Fry told Lawrence earlier.
I think everyone has a similar set of problems, to be honest, and it's just you're balancing entry stability, low speed understeer and high speed oversteer, and it's really just finding ways to deal with all of that and improve the overall balance as well as improving the overall downforce.
Well, it's interesting to hear Pat Fry saying that they've got the same problems as everybody, because actually for Williams, that's a really big step forwards. They can't specifically identify a particular characteristic or trait that the car has that's holding them back a little bit. So that's really good because the team has been some way off in recent years, it's fair to say. No longer the bottom of the Constructors' Championship and actually fighting in the midfield properly is a big step forwards. Not fighting for race wins yet, but God, a well-timed safety car in Baku could have seen something a bit special. The reason I've got the roll hoop up here is this is an indication of one of the biggest changes the team has made. They managed to lighten the car substantially, changing the roll hoop mid-season, and this is the old specification here. And you can tell the old specification because it's got this horizontal vein in the middle of the airbox. The new version, covered up in this shot, but you can see it very clear when the car's out on track, has a little A shape. Not for Alex Albon, just for splitting up the different segments of the air channeling underneath the bodywork. Centre section feeds the engine, sections on the outside feed coolers further back down the car. Lightening that section is a huge task, and Craig Scarborough is going to be taking a look at how roll hoops are designed and manufactured in a future episode of Tech Talk coming soon, so keep an eye out for that one. But that's not the only change Williams have been making. Of course, we mentioned that floor change that got them in a little bit of trouble at Zandvoort, ever so slightly too wide. Pretty sure Logan Sargent would have been disqualified as well if he hadn't destroyed the floor, as we saw earlier in the show. However, they've got that working, made it legal, and it does seem to be working, doesn't it? The other big change is to the cooling system. We discussed that a few races ago. This is a big change to that overbite style side pod, becoming a bit of a trend up and down the grid. Williams finding that is finally working for them. The Williams team, always innovating, of course, have now got a fairly conventional front wing end plate. You can see the dive plane here, pretty much standard for up and down the pit lane. Having dropped that big cheese wedge style version they used at the start of the season. Interesting design, didn't seem to work, the team dropped it, and they've been mucking around with their front wing designs ever since, seeming to find a slightly happier place with it. But as we get to the Singapore Grand Prix, the team hasn't stopped upgrading the car, and there was a big change to the front end of the car, even though it was very subtle to see on the car, to Alex Albon's Williams, but not that of Franco Colapinto. Discussing those changes, finally, Pat Fry once again.
For this race, we've updated the front suspension. There's been a huge amount of work going on, all through the factory, from the aero department all the way through design, manufacture. Yeah, I mean, to say there's a reasonable performance step. A little bit's come everywhere, a little bit of aerodynamic performance and better through corner balance. So it'll be interesting to actually run it today and see where we are.
So let's take a look at those changes. And as I say, they are very subtle, and it is to this section of the exposed bits of the front suspension. We can see it because one car's got it, the other car doesn't. And that's because the team possibly didn't have enough parts ready, but also possibly wanted to back-to-back test them, which a lot of teams do. So we'll see if Colapinto gets the upgrade package later on. The brake duct shape has also changed on Alex Albon's Williams ever so slightly compared to that of Colapinto. This is more obvious when you look from the side. It's actually not the shape of the scoop, it's the shape of this section here. Now this is a bit of rules play that every team is mucking about with. The brake cooling ducts are meant to be exclusively for brake cooling. No team uses them exclusively for brake cooling. Every team uses them to get an aerodynamic advantage, and that's exactly what Williams are playing around with here. And they've just re-sculpted the outside shape of it and how it links to the front suspension element, and that's something that the team are hoping works out well for Colapinto when he gets it, but definitely for Albon. And you can see why it's important, because it's just ahead of the leading edge of the floor and the entry to the floor tunnels, and that's why the teams are always experimenting with the front suspension layout and those brake ducts, and Williams are hoping to make a step forward again with those new parts. And in free practice, it did look to be working, but the track conditions were absolutely nowhere, and actually making a judgment on free practice times is deeply, deeply unwise. Now, Williams have told us there isn't actually that much more to come from this car. They are going to bring a few more small detailed upgrades, but there's no big packages to come onto this machine, because all attention at the moment is focused on next year's car, where they do hope to make another big step. However, the Williams team are having to divide their time between next year's car and the 2026 design, which will be started on in earnest, at least in terms of the aerodynamic structures, on the 1st of January. And at that point, I suspect the work on next year's car will slow down considerably. So what we might see at the start of next season from Williams may be what we have for the rest of the year. But if they're much more competitive, they are going to have to make a decision on how much effort they put into 2026 and how much effort they put into this year's car. It could be a tricky challenge for Williams, but it could be a tricky challenge for everybody up and down the field. So let's see how Williams gets on with this package as we move forward through the rest of the season, and all those little upgrades they tell us they're going to be bringing. We'll have to see what they actually consist of, and how Colapinto and Albon fare for the rest of the year before Carlos Sainz joins the team next season.